Welcome back to Spill. I'm Amy Westervelt. Today, I'm joined by one of my favorite climate reporters, Abrahm Lustgarten from ProPublica. I am eternally jealous of Abraham's ability to take really complicated subjects and make them totally accessible and structure these very long, complicated stories in a way that makes them a total joy to read. So I was excited to see that he was working on a new book. That book is out now. It's called On the Move. It's about climate migration and how it's happening within the U.S. So how extreme weather events and the increasing impacts of climate change are causing major shifts within the country. A lot of times we hear about climate migration and we think about people moving from one country to another, or one part of the planet to another, and that's definitely also happening. There's a lot of internal migration within countries as well. Abrahm started reporting on this years ago. He's got just tons and tons of amazing research in here and stories, and he makes it all really come alive by following some particular people on their journey through navigating this crisis. That conversation is coming up after this quick break.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Learning through play starts with Lego Duplo. With Lego Duplo, toddlers can develop real-life skills while having fun with colorful bricks made just for them. Large, easy to grip, and safe to explore. When children express themselves with Lego Duplo, they build patience, problem-solving, and empathy. See your child learn perseverance and self-expression with everything they imagine and create. Visit lego.com/preschool to learn more.
You know that feeling when someone shows up for you just when you need it most? That's what Uber is all about. Not just a ride or dinner at your door. It's how Uber helps you show up for the moments that matter. Because showing up can turn a tough day around or make a good one even better. Whatever it is, big or small, Uber is on the way. So you can be on yours. Uber, on our way.
I'm Abrahm Lustgarten. I'm a reporter at ProPublica covering climate change, and I'm the author of On the Move, The Overheating Earth and the Uprooting of America.
I was really struck by your book actually from page one because I was like, oh, this reminds me of how I left California. I mean, it wasn't the only thing, but it was certainly a motivating factor that, we spent like 2 summers in a row smoked into our house and had to evacuate a couple times and all of that. So very close to, to home.
And I had good friends that left, and it's never really like the only thing. It's all, it's always just one of those straws that's piling up along with all the other indecision and reasons and family and draws and school and whatever.
It almost reminds me a little bit of the way that the conversation around population and climate has evolved, where like it was a little bit abstract maybe 10, 15 years ago, and sometimes people would even use it. Like I personally knew a couple of women who were like, sometimes I just tell people that I don't want to have kids because of climate change, but I actually just don't want to have kids, period. But now when I talk to people about it, it's much more personal and sort of visceral. It's more like, well, I'm worried about the world that, kids born now would have. It feels more, up close in the same way that I feel like climate migration does. Like we talked about it it was sort of like big projected numbers and very abstract movements. And now it's getting much more kind of real. I don't know if that's your experience too.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, even the book talks about that because it's sort of premised on this idea that we all now know what this climate change thing feels like, that it's not just this theoretical thing, but we're living through it in our various ways, whether it's like wildfire smoke that we have to deal with in a terrible summer, or incredible heat, or thinking about our kids, or whatever, that it's in our face. And that changes, I think, the whole experience around it, around where we live, but also, how we want to have families and all of those things.
Yeah. I know you talk about this in the book, but there's been talk about international migration, but various conversations you were having and things you were seeing led you to focus on migration in the US. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little bit more, because I still think people don't necessarily think about domestic moves when they think about climate migration.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all relative, right? I mean, we are relatively sheltered and relatively wealthy here in the United States. But the fact is globally that there's a shift, northward in the ideal habitat that researchers associate with human habitation. The kind of, environment that we've lived in for 6,000 years is changing, and it's moving north. And globally, that is, projected to affect where billions of people choose to live. Not that all of them will migrate, but that number of people will have to kind of rethink where they live. There's a great conversation to be had about that global impact, but I was really interested in focusing on what that meant for the United States with, its relative safety, because the fact is that moving climate niche is still going to affect North America as well. And it is sliding northward. And as it does that, it is putting the southernmost parts of the country into not an unlivable zone, but a marginal zone from a climate perspective, or at least that's what the models say. And that suggests that, tens of millions of Americans will also be climate migrants. And geeky of me, perhaps, but I was just really interested in drilling down into what that means for this country. Like what happens to certain regions that are still the fastest growing now if people start leaving, or what does it mean for parts of the United States to become, less livable or feel like places that people don't want to be? And then what happens to all the places that people wind up? And so, that was the premise and the motivation. And then, the data that I used kind of backed up that theory, suggesting 13 to 160 million Americans would be affected. Take your guess how many actually move, but pointing to them moving northward towards the Great Lakes, towards the Northeast, towards the Canadian border, where crop yields will increase, where temperatures will remain more temperate, and there's plentiful fresh water.
Can you talk a little bit about just how and whether the US government is looking at this stuff, and also what some states are doing to either prepare, or I know, some states are starting to grapple with the idea of managed retreat, but it's pretty early days still. And I'd love to have you kind of walk us through a little bit of what you found there.
Yeah, it's really early days. And generally what I found, in the United States is that, air quotes, big government is not addressing this. It has barely begun to think about it, if they have at all, and its many implications. On a local level, I found little patches where there was progressive conversation, particularly in potential receiving zones. So I met, for example, with folks in places like Ann Arbor, Michigan and Detroit, Michigan, who were thinking about, does climate migration mean that they're going to see, great future growth, and how can they plan for that growth? Should the city of Ann Arbor, which was in the process of approving, $100 million sewage treatment plant, should it oversize it and spend $110 million now, to have that sort of 10% increased capacity with climate migration in mind? So that's one way. I talked to folks in the city of Atlanta who were, again, I think ahead of the curve from a policy perspective in recognizing that a lot of Atlanta's growth is probably already due to climate migration, and that a lot of its future growth would be. And, Atlanta's been trying to green itself and become a more sustainable city in a lot of ways for the past 10 years. It's built new greenways and parks and made a lot of changes that have, improved the livability of that city. And Atlanta is now also seeing that those changes come, that there's a double-edged sword, particularly gentrification that happens as it greens certain neighborhoods. And so it's starting to think of climate migration and growth more as the complex challenge that it is, where you have to think about housing policy in advance, and you have to think about tax policy that can keep people in generational housing from being driven out by, appreciating home values, for example, and things like that aren't typically climate issues, but in this way are proving to be climate issues. But nationally, I've heard nothing from a federal government that has a great stake in considering, the distribution of its people and its voters across the whole country. The federal government has identified climate migration as an issue that it needs to do more about internationally. And the Biden administration issued a report on that a couple of years ago, and it's done virtually nothing to follow through on the recommendations of its own report so far, let alone to focus on this inside the country. And there's a whole section of my book that actually looks at the things that policymakers in the U.S. are still doing wrong, perverse incentives that tend to encourage people to move in the wrong direction or live in the most climate vulnerable places. And I think that's one of the reasons why people do live in really vulnerable parts of the U.S. But all those policies are beginning to correct maybe a little bit, but they haven't really changed yet either.
Can you talk a little bit about some specifics of those policies that are either incentivizing people to stay in climate vulnerable places, or, like you mentioned, incentivizing them to move to places that are not a great idea, given what we know about what's coming?
Yeah. So, even as we start this conversation about climate migration in the U.S., 9 of the 10 fastest growing regions in the country are places that we would think of as climate vulnerable. They're extremely hot in the Southwest, or they're on the Gulf Coast, or they're in Florida or Southern California. And one of the reasons that I look at a number of perverse incentives, but one of the most significant policies that the United States has always had is subsidizing property insurance, which basically makes it cheaper for people to live in these dangerous places and shields them, and also hides their perception of the risk that they're taking on and living in those places. And this was very deliberate. So, it goes back to 1992 when Hurricane Andrew struck Florida and wiped tens of thousands of structures off the Florida map. And, the commercial insurance market looked at that disaster and said, we're out. We can't cover these properties in the face of the looming threats and still make a profit. So we're going to stop offering policies. And the state of Florida, already facing a really challenging economy at the time, said, logically, without insurance, our economy is going to dive deeper. People are going to leave. We don't want to see that sort of degrowth or loss of economic growth in Florida. And so we're going to create our own state subsidized insurance policy. We'll make it available to anybody who wants it. And eventually they added up their ante with promising that it would be cheaper than any other commercial policy they could get. And it was super effective. People kept moving to Florida, and millions more people have moved to Florida since then and built along, the coast, one of the most vulnerable, sea rise parts of the country. And other states have looked at that as a model and replicated it. And there's similar insurance plans now across 30 states. California is relying on it heavily to both protect people, but also to still subsidize insurance for people living in wildfire interface zones. And it's a classic example of, one of the things that's made it easy for people to live in high risk areas. But other things that come up range from, incredibly cheap water in Arizona, where it's expensive to move water to, but the federal government pays for most of that cost. The kind of disaster aid that federal government sends out, to rebuild communities after hurricanes and floods using federal dollars, to compensate for like poor local planning or poor investment decisions on a local level. Crop subsidies that pay farmers to grow things like cotton in the Arizona desert. These are all things that, make it cheaper for people to live in places where there are very significant climate-driven costs, but individual people haven't had to pay those costs because one form of policy or another pays it for them.
Yeah, I'd love to have you actually kind of maybe tell that story of you start with Ellen and her anxiety about all of the fires happening, and then, her neighborhood gets forever changed by this fire. And then, towards the end of the book, we see, they're trying to rebuild there. And I feel like this gets sort of championed in the media a lot, like the rebuild thing as like a triumph of some kind, but
we're so resilient, right? We can go back and make things just the way they were.
Yeah. So I'd love to have you talk through that a little bit, that story, and then also what is going on with this idea of resilience.
Yeah. Well, let me just say first, I mean, like the insurance thing is a beguiling subject, and it's complicated, in part because it's also really necessary and it helps a lot of people. And it's it is an important backstop for people who have their lives and their savings at risk and need that support where it's not good.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, we've seen this now in both Florida and California where, insurance companies have decided not to insure some places anymore. And the states have stepped in to, almost be the insurance company in a way, which seems, I don't know, it just seems like a safety net that's built to fail in the near term. I don't know.
Yeah, or I think of it as a safety net that's meant to be smaller, right? And climate change is forcing it to be, oversized. And I mean, losing insurance ruins lives. And so it is a nice safety net to provide. And especially, poorer segments of the population need that. But where it goes wrong is where it serves to encourage more growth into dangerous areas. I mean, in California, that means that, it's one thing to rebuild a neighborhood that's been in Santa Rosa for a better part of 100 years or for 70 years or whatever. It's another to go and build whole new developments of thousands of homes pushing up against the foothills into forest areas that don't have great road access, and to justify all of those investments. Banks make loans on those projects based on the availability of insurance. So in that case, using those insurance subsidies is literally expanding the risk into places where people shouldn't live and don't already have ties to and don't need to, go and live there. So it's really, a double-edged sword that way. We can't afford to lose that insurance, but we need to be careful about how we expand it and how it's applied too. But Ellen Hurdell, I chose to focus on Ellen Hurdell's story partially because it's similar to my own and partially because it's not a simple, linear story. I think it's really easy when you're talking about climate migration to choose examples of, extreme displacement, and the tragedy of being forced to move somewhere. And those are dramatic, maybe even, hyperbolic stories. But Ellen's is something more complex that I think points to, what a human dilemma, this whole subject area is. And so, Ellen is, she's a California native. Her entire family lives around her in Northern California in Sonoma County. And she lives in the city of Santa Rosa. And in 2015, her in-laws lost their home a little bit north of her to a wildfire. And Ellen then saw subsequent fires in 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20, pretty much every year, if not right in her yard or in her backyard, very close, across the northern part of the state. And cumulatively is deeply impacted by them. She has 2 young daughters at the time, and they live through this, this harrowing process of being woken up in the middle of the night, getting in the car and evacuating, getting their pets into pet crates and jamming them into the car and, racing down their hillside as fire trucks are racing up, and never quite losing their home, themselves, but living in this kind of state of fear and constant disruption, and seeing their friends move or lose their own homes. And with this great perception, especially, her kids from a very young age, of living amongst destruction, climate-driven destruction. And naturally, this weighs on her. And she begins to think about moving in the same way, I've thought about moving from my, San Francisco area home. And so many other people do. In the end, and I come back to her towards the end of the book, she doesn't move, or she hasn't moved yet, which is also, kind of represents the complexity of the difficult decision and where I am personally. But she's in a new realm of kind of accepting, the discontinuity of this, climate future and the unpredictability of it and the unsettledness of it all. So she is no longer a homeowner, but she lives in a rented home that's a little bit easier to, get out of on a moment's notice. She talks about, whether the future is a nomadic future where maybe she doesn't get to be a full-time California resident, but only a wintertime California resident, or things like that. And she doesn't have answers and hasn't made decisions, but these thoughts are reflections of how unpredictable her future is and how much she now accepts that it is unpredictable. And in the meantime, as you described, I mean, she has been squeezed by these monumental fires right around her in Santa Rosa. One of them was the Tubbs fire. It burned 3,500 homes overnight in a residential suburban area that didn't seem like it was especially wildfire prone, and it killed 22 people. And it's really a horrific, event in the history of this part of the state. And I've been there a number of times. It's not very far from where I live. But when I went back recently, and what I describe, in the book is this rebuilding, which is astonishing, not so surprising, like down in the flats of Santa Rosa, which is, the more suburban part of town, very logical to rebuild that. But up on the ridgetop too, which is, a more wildfire prone area that had burned historically and burned again in the Tubbs fire. And instead of taking that lesson, these fancy homes are all being rebuilt. They're still being rebuilt now. It's been 6 years, and there's still construction going on. And it's a ghostly environment. There's not a lot of vegetation. There's these black spires of burnt trees that still sort of jut up into the air. But there's these $4 million mansions being built right beneath them with swimming pools and 5 bedrooms and 3-car garages. And it's quite the spectacle. It's an interesting kind of, glimpse into the crossroads of climate impact and climate migration.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think. This is sort of a philosophical question, but I am curious what you think about this idea of constantly rebuilding in very vulnerable areas being portrayed as a resilience or an adaptation or like a triumph. It seems so arbitrary where to draw that line, and it would be different for almost every person. So I'm not sure how we grapple with that. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that it's an incredibly complex and difficult question. And in terms of, individual decision making, I talk about my book as, not being prescriptive. And that's because I don't think there's any, one right answer, and this shouldn't be a moral issue. It's not like everybody has to come to terms with the fact that they have to move, and it's a matter of when. It's more like recognizing the weight, of the circumstance on people's lives. And so I think, you're asking about, like, from a community perspective, how, what's the right thing to do. And so I think it's similarly complex. Like, we will have a very difficult time politically, economically, maybe morally, telling people, where they shouldn't go home to when people already have homes and ties and history. So that's really, really complex. And I think that there's a nice middle ground that's beginning to be struck, by programs that are helping resettle, buyout programs in coastal flooded areas or hurricane zones, for example. And I think maybe a little bit of that's happening in wildfire zones, which gives people a choice, but also gives them, a way out. And, that's in the form of like policy that buys their property and gives them money to buy a different property somewhere else if they choose to leave. But I think it's really, problematic then to take a place like Santa Rosa and say, well, now that this neighborhood is burned, we're going to close it off completely and not let you return. But again, there's a lot of, especially in California, there's rapid population growth and rapid expansion that's been happening for many, many, decades and continues to happen into places that have never been built. And I think it's a lot less problematic to say, look, we have a hotter, drier future ahead of us. And we know 100% that these are not safe places to build homes, and that these are extremely expensive, dangerous places to defend homes. And so we're going to have new zoning that says, let's not expand further into these places. So to me, that's the middle ground where I would support stopping new growth or directing new growth. But it's really challenging to judge and then turn people away from places where they already call home.
Totally. What about, and you mentioned this in a few different spots, and I feel like it comes up more around sea level rise than, the fire situation that we've been talking about. But this idea of managed retreat and when to start moving people when you know the danger is coming, I feel like that's almost harder to figure out. And again, some people will want to do that. Some people won't. And some people, as you write, will be kind of trapped because of various circumstances. So yeah, I'm curious what you think about the whole managed retreat conversation. And I'll tell you just from my own standpoint that I find it a little bit terrifying, because who's making those decisions and how can we make them sort of equitable? I don't know. We haven't done a great job of that on housing and zoning and all these other things. So it feels a little precarious. But yeah, I'm curious what you think about it.
Yeah. So with the caveat that, it hasn't been a great focus of mine, and I don't have great expertise, I agree with you that it's thorny in terms of, how you administer it equitably and how you don't, just repeat a whole bunch of other past mistakes in terms of, how inequitable our housing policy has been and our, subsidies and all of that. So it's a minefield in that area. But my personal opinion is that it's necessary. And I do see that I think there's growing acceptance of this idea from a policy standpoint, and also, from like an academic and prescriptive standpoint. This is, a growing thing, and it's going to be a bigger thing. And, one of the reasons why I think it's necessary is because, especially when we're talking about, sea level rise and coastal flooding, we can see that the future costs, of defending a place and defending people are going to be insurmountable and maybe impossible, right? Certain places will be underwater. And so if you weigh that against, the disruption of encouraging people to move now and the potential inequities of doing that, it still seems like a worthwhile thing to do, because if you don't do it now, that future disaster and disruption will only be more painful. And in a lot of these places, it's really inevitable. And, and we have a bad track record of how we've handled, exposure to risk in the past. We have a national flood insurance program that, has rebuilt people's homes in floodplains 6 times over. And it's like, if a place has already flooded that many times repetitively, why would we rebuild? Why would anybody want to, stay in that same place? And while giving them the choice to maybe still make that bad decision, I think it's smart to at least provide a mechanism to help people, get out. And that's really what I think managed retreat, is a buyout program that says, here's some money. Don't rebuild your house. Don't make this insurance claim. And here you can go use this money towards, purchasing elsewhere. The challenge is, like, how do you value that property fairly? How do you make sure that the people displaced aren't devalued, one, because of, perceived flood risk, which is happening, which is the federal government or insurance companies come in and they say, oh, you have extreme climate risk, so your place wasn't worth as much as you thought in the first place, which is a terrible place to start that conversation. And then behind that are all, in a lot of places are all these other legacy inequities, whether it's, redlining against minority communities from, a century ago that have kept property values depressed, or just lack of investment, in a lot of poor minority communities since then that have the effect of making home values in, some neighborhoods a lot less than they are in other neighborhoods. So if you're going to, manage retreat and give people compensation, and you're going to do that based on the value of their home, there's a lot of sort of tricky questions about how you actually value their home and what the money is that you give them. And, I think that money should be a larger amount for many, many people. But then the flip side of that problem is the scope of the threat in the United States is so enormous that it's really unrealistic to think that, our government or any government will ever be able to really pay for the cost of full managed retreat from all risk zones. So, that's on the other end of the spectrum. That's a problem. And so it's a conundrum. And I don't know, what the solution will be. I think it's early days in that conversation, but I'm happy to see that there are expanding managed retreat programs across the country at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. There was this really interesting situation in Pacifica. There was a neighborhood there that the city of Pacifica was trying to do like a managed retreat program with, but the neighborhood totally fought it because they were so worried that as soon as those words were mentioned, it would make their property value fall, which is interesting because it's like, well, your property is going to fall if it like falls over the cliff in Pacifica as well.
Right.
Which houses in that neighborhood were starting to do. I think it was like 1 or 2 houses had already kind of fallen off of this eroding cliff. It was a good example of sort of how crazy these conversations can get, I don't know.
Yeah, I have followed that. And it's a great example of the cross currents of this issue, right? Like, I guess the way I see that is, it's true that you put up one signal of devaluing property values and it can very quickly lead to a collapse, and that collapse can hurt a lot of people. And so it's really natural that, that communities would want to defend against that. If you don't think you're going to move, and especially if you're in California and you've seen your property values skyrocket, you don't want to lose that asset value or that notional value either. And so it makes perfect sense to me that people would fight that. But on the other hand, that change is inevitable and it's already coming and it's already had effect. Pacifica is like, I forget if it's McDonald's or Taco Bell or whatever, but it's like the only it's the only town in California that has a Taco Bell on the beach. And the reason that can afford to run that kind of franchise on the beach is because that property is already not worth very much, it's already seen as so highly valuable.
I've been there. Yeah.
Right. So, so that devaluation is already happening. And, and then my other sort of just, dark comment or dark thought on this is that tragedy is an unavoidable part of this process. There is not going to be like a perfectly smooth retreat where we all get to keep all of our chips and, and take them home, unfortunately. And I think part of what, planners are asking for when they say, let's plan in advance, or let's have policy that helps these transitions, or managed retreat, or let's incorporate the ideas of climate migration into urban growth, is let's do the best we can to make those tragedies less, but they're kind of unavoidable, but they'll be a little less impactful if we try to get ahead of them to the extent that we still can.
I wanted to ask you another insurance thing, because there's so many stories coming out about the insurance industry all the time at the moment, where a lot of the companies that are pulling out of insuring homes because of climate risk, for example, are still insuring pipelines and other things driving the climate crisis. But I especially was really struck recently by a couple of reports from insurance companies, or even like from the Fed, where there's just this general idea of like, the world is like, there was a report I saw that actually came out a few years ago where an insurance company said the world will not be insurable past the year 2050. And I was like, wow, that's like an interesting thing to think about, because I think the way we think about insurance in general is this idea of like predictable and then managed risk, which to me seems like this sort of fundamental thing that you're talking about in the book, that it's like, that's just not a thing anymore. And I wonder just what you think about that.
Yeah, totally. And I do think this is our new normal. The funny thing about the insurance industry, or our public perception maybe of the insurance industry, is, that people seem to be confused about its purpose in the world. And, that there's an expectation that it exists for the public good and has, a responsibility to the public. And while, I think it does do both those things a little bit, its primary responsibility is to turn a profit by making a short-term wager, that the money it pays out, for one disaster or one expense in one place is exceeded by the money it takes in another place. And that's the fundamental dynamic. This is not a public program, and it's not a charitable program. And, if anything, I think we can criticize our own, economy and society for relying on a private market insurance solution too much. But since we do, I always think it's sort of funny that we expect these companies to go out and like do the right thing, as opposed to, do the thing that's profitable for them. So that's sort of like my background, cynical view. But I think that that's the lens through which to see a lot of their decision making, which for one is very short term, which is a problem. If in the case of property insurance, many homes, most buildings in the United States are insured on a 1-year basis, and the insurance company can drop that coverage at any point in time. So there's really no like long-term investment in either building resilience or a sustainable environment or community. They just make their profit based decisions, on a very short-term basis. And, when it comes to like insuring or profit making from pipelines as opposed to, property insurance, I think I think there's less thought and premeditation that goes into that than we might like to think. And I suspect that it's, much more of a short-term profit-driven, not value-driven calculation on their part. And that's hugely problematic in a lot of ways, but I think that's sort of the reality. And so, when you say like long-term, you're reading that the world will become uninsurable, I think what that means from the insurance company's perspective is they don't have any confidence in how to evaluate, historical data versus future data in a way that makes them confident that they can turn a profit, that their, income will exceed their expenses in any given year. And that is a measure of uncertainty, but literally to an insurance company, that's what that means. It's not like that they couldn't turn a profit insuring homes in California, but that they're not sure that they will. And so they don't have a business plan that says that this is still viable. And, and that's a give and take. And one of the gives is how much do you pay for your insurance in the first place? And it might, and in the US, all of our insurance is regulated by state agencies that control, how much those prices go up. And that's one of the huge problems in California. But if California were to say, instead of limiting, price increases, that it's okay, Allstate, if you want to charge $20,000 a year for home insurance, and we'll let homeowners figure out how they can or can't afford that. It might be that insurance companies are like, well, now we can turn a profit, and now we will stick around, and we can insure a future warming world if we charge enough for it. But that also raises a whole other set of rising expenses and thorny issues. So I don't know. Insurance is it's a real thicket. I hear really, scary things from experts I talk to about the state of the insurance industry right now from a financial perspective, and we might be in for a rocky near future in terms of insurance coverage in general.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like people's relationship to insurance needs to fundamentally shift too. Like, we think of it as being this safety net, and that's what we pay for, right? But we all started to have this realization with medical insurance,
right.
Where you're like, what am I paying for? And now it seems like it's creeping into other realms too. Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about is back to this place that you end at with Ellen, where she's taken this adaptation kind of approach that it just was interesting to me, because I feel like whenever we hear about climate adaptation, it's usually in the form of building seawalls, or I guess managed retreat could even be a form of it. But in her case, it almost feels like a state of mind that I think actually is a little bit helpful to think about. Like, what are the psychological or emotional approaches we all need to start taking to kind of adjust to this new normal? And yeah, I wonder what you think about that. And also like, where you're at with that after doing all of this research is tough. It's tough when you're like working on these issues and like living them at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I do think that, our like emotional and psychological approach to, to change and to climate change is a huge part of what it means to adapt to it. I think that should be a bigger part of the conversation. And I think it's a huge part of, people's experience as they grapple with this stuff. And I don't know why we don't talk about it that much, I guess, because it's not, it's not funded in, tax-driven infrastructure investments or federal policy or things like that. So, so in Ellen's case, she has a lot of choices about how to adapt, where she lives and if she owns her home, and those kinds of things, let alone her political decisions and what kind of policies she supports. But among those is just her state of mind, and and I think that she's found a greater degree of resilience by kind of coming to terms with the risk. And I think this is a process a lot of us can relate to. I definitely can personally, which is that the more you come to understand, how much our world is changing because of climate change and what those specific impacts are, you go through several stages of realizing, what that information means. And one of them, is that it's horrifying and it's scary and it's super disruptive and it's overwhelming. But I think that there's an exit from that part of the experience at a certain point that becomes a lot more pragmatic, where, you kind of, in Ellen's case, you come to understand what that risk is. And by thinking about it a whole lot, it's a little less scary. It becomes a little more familiar. And then it's something that you can deal with a little more pragmatically. And I think, that's where she is that like the shock and the fear, is receding a little bit, which doesn't make the risk any different, but it changes your relationship to it. And in her case, she's finding that she needs to live a little bit more flexibly, that she needs to be resilient in a way that, lets her deal with shocks or not be totally surprised by the unexpected or by the unforeseen. And then so she's a little more ready for that next disruption, or, would be a little less surprised by it when it comes. And, in my personal experiences, definitely all of that. So it, includes what I just described, but also, my process and where I live has forced me to kind of mentally, create a balance sheet of, so I've come to understand the risks, and they are, horrifying and scary, but I've also devoted a lot of time and effort to thinking about the benefits and, really understanding, what my decision is. So it's not just if I don't move, and I haven't moved. So it's not just a default, or an unthoughtful situation. And in my case, it's that I really appreciate a lot about where I live. I live adjacent to natural areas and the ocean and beautiful places that I really take advantage of and I spend a lot of time in, and that also, contributes to, to my personal mental health and to, my family's well-being and all of that. And so, there's all the columns in my balance sheet are a little more explicit and a little better understood by me now. And it doesn't make the climate risk go away, but it just, it makes that decision a little bit more practical, gives me something to work with. And, and I also, feel like the future's uncertain, and maybe there are no more long-term decisions, but I can at least understand, what might seem irrational, which is that, I still really love a lot of things about where I live, despite its risk. And so for now, that keeps me where I am.
Okay, sorry, I lied. One more question. This I always ask people this when they've done a big reporting project or a book, and I am curious to hear from you. What was like the one thing that jumped out to you that was the most surprising in the research that you did? I know you've been working on this for years, so I'm curious if there was any one thing that really shocked you.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind first, and I'm probably forgetting something else, that would answer this question, but it actually goes to a part of my reporting that wasn't in the United States, but that I do write about in the book. And it was early in the years that I spent reporting on climate migration. I went down to Guatemala and El Salvador and spent a bunch of time in a number of communities there, trying to kind of get a sense of how people were making that decision, about when to move, and if it was climate driven, but also just like, how does one decide, what's the human experience of climate change, and how does one decide to move? And it was a real kind of wake up call to me to understand that for a lot of people in those places, the decision to move was like the most devastating, heartbreaking act of desperation that they could conceive of, and very different from what I had expected. I kind of expected this pros and cons column for them, that migration, immigration, is like a climate influenced economic decision, and still very much about like pursuit of opportunity or pursuit of hope, or, or a calculated decision. And what I found instead was that the environmental changes were driving like a level of hopelessness and environmental devastation that left people with no choice whatsoever, and that most people don't want to move, or if they wanted to move, they want to move the shortest distance possible. And I think that's true whether it's the United States or or a more developing part of the world. And that was really shocking to me. It just changed my whole conception of what is migration. For some people, for sure, they'll move long distances out of, ambition and economic opportunity. But when we're talking about displacement, it opened my eyes to it being a much more tragic kind of thing.
Yeah. Spill is a climate news and culture podcast brought to you by the teams behind Drilled and Hot Take. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was engineered by Peter Duff. You can find the stories that we mentioned in this episode on the Drilled website at drilled.media. Go check them out.